The first time Lisa saw the painting, her heart stopped. It was hanging in the back of the art room, hidden behind the curtain where the teacher kept her unfinished work. The canvas was huge, much bigger than anything the students had worked on, and the image, an abstract swirl of dark colors and jagged shapes, felt alive, as though it were shifting when no one was looking. Lisa swore she could see something moving in the shadows, something waiting. She shuddered and stepped back, her fingers trembling. "Hey, what are you looking at?" A voice came from behind her. It was Sophie, her best friend and the only other person in the advanced art class. "Nothing," Lisa lied, pulling the curtain closed. But the image was burned into her mind. Even as Sophie dragged her back to the table, chattering about the latest assignment, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that painting. It started innocently enough. Miss Kearney, the new art teacher, had arrived with an eccentric flair, sweeping into the room with wild, curly hair and bright scarves. She had a strange energy about her, always talking with an intensity that made the students hang on her every word. She was unlike any teacher they'd had before. "Art comes from within, from your deepest emotions," Miss Kearney had said that first day, pacing in front of the class. "Today, we're going to dig deep. I want you to paint what scares you the most. I want you to confront your fears." Most of the students had laughed it off, treating it as just another assignment. But not Lisa. Her fear was all too real. She hated the dark. Ever since she was little, the shadows had terrified her, the way they seemed to stretch and bend, hiding things that shouldn't be there. It wasn't something she talked about, not even with Sophie, but as Miss Kearney pushed her to tap into that fear, Lisa felt the darkness creeping into her mind, curling around her thoughts like smoke. "Don't overthink it," Miss Kearney had said, her voice low and almost soothing. "Just let the fear guide your hand." Lisa had painted feverishly, her brush moving as though it had a mind of its own. The colors were dark, swirling together to form a twisting black void in the center of the canvas. Shapes, like twisted hands, reached out from the darkness, grasping at the edges of the frame. By the time she was finished, she felt drained, her heart racing with an anxiety she couldn't explain. When she looked at the painting, she had to hold back a scream. It was alive, or it felt alive, pulsing, shifting. The longer she stared, the more she could see the shadows move, see the shapes crawling just beyond the frame. She tried to tell herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, the nightmares began. Lisa woke in a cold sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had dreamed of the painting, the same swirling darkness, the same grasping hands, only this time they weren't confined to the canvas. They had reached out, long skeletal fingers curling around her throat, squeezing until she couldn't breathe. The next morning at school, Lisa was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Sophie noticed immediately. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Lisa shook her head, her hands trembling. I had a nightmare," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "About the painting." Sophie's expression softened. "It's just a painting, Lisa. You're probably just stressed." But it wasn't just stress. Over the next few days, the nightmares grew worse. Every night, the shadows seemed to get closer, the hands reaching further, their grip tightening. She started to dread going to bed, knowing what was waiting for her on the other side of sleep. At school, Miss Kearney continued to push the class. The other students seemed to enjoy it, taking pride in their work. But Lisa noticed something strange. Everyone's paintings had become darker, more twisted. The once vibrant classroom was now filled with canvases covered in black, red, and deep purples, each one more disturbing than the last. And then Sophie's painting changed. She had been working on a piece that was supposed to be abstract, just bright colors and random shapes. But one day, Lisa noticed it wasn't abstract anymore. There was a figure in the center now, tall and looming, its face twisted into something grotesque. The colors had shifted too, turning dark and menacing. "Sophie, what happened to your painting?" Lisa asked cautiously. Sophie stared at it, her face blank. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I didn't paint that." Things spiraled after that. Students began to complain about seeing strange things in the corners of their vision shadows, moving where there shouldn't be any, whispers in empty hallways. One student even claimed that their painting had talked to them, whispering horrible things in the dead of night. Miss Kearney dismissed the rumors with a wave of her hand, insisting that they were all just letting their imaginations get the best of them. But Lisa knew better. The painting was growing more dangerous. She could feel it, an overwhelming presence whenever she was near it, like something was watching her from inside the canvas. One afternoon, she stayed after class, determined to confront Miss Kearney. "What are you doing to us?" Lisa demanded, her voice shaking. "Why are the paintings changing?" Miss Kearney looked up from her desk, her eyes gleaming with something cold and sharp. "I told you from the beginning," she said, her voice soft. "Art comes from within. What you're seeing is what you've created." "But it's not us," Lisa insisted, her heart pounding. "It's something else, something wrong." Miss Kearney smiled, then a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. "You're right," she said. "It's not you. It's much older. But once you've tapped into it, there's no going back." That night, Lisa couldn't sleep. Every shadow in her room seemed to stretch toward her, like the painting was leaking into her reality. Then she heard it. A whisper low, indistinct, but unmistakable. It was coming from her painting, which she had left propped against the wall. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Without thinking, she grabbed the painting and threw it into the closet, slamming the door shut. But the whisper didn't stop. It became a voice, no voices layered on top of each other, all speaking in a language she couldn't understand, but the message was clear. It was hungry. Panicked, Lisa raced to Sophie's house the next morning, her hand shaking as she rang the doorbell. Sophie answered, looking as haggard and terrified as Lisa felt. "They're alive," Sophie whispered. "The paintings, they're alive." Lisa didn't need convincing. "We have to destroy them." That night, they broke into the art room, determined to burn the paintings, all of them. But when they opened the classroom door, they froze. The paintings were already waiting. They were hanging on the walls, but they were no longer static images. The figures moved within the frames, their eyes following Lisa and Sophie as they crept inside. The air was thick with the smell of paint and something sour like death. Miss Kearney was standing in the center of the room, watching them with that same unsettling smile. "You can't destroy them," she said, her voice a low hiss. "They're part of you now." Before Lisa could respond, the shadows began to pour out of the paintings, swirling around them like smoke, cold and suffocating. The figures inside the frames started to crawl out, their twisted limbs reaching toward them. "Run!" Lisa screamed, grabbing Sophie's hand as they bolted for the door. But the shadows were faster. The last thing Lisa saw before the darkness consumed her was Miss Kearney's smile satisfied. When the school opened the next day, Lisa and Sophie were gone. Their paintings, however, were still there, 2 new canvases hanging in the art room. The students who entered could swear they saw the girls' faces hidden in the shadows of the paintings, their expressions frozen in eternal horror. When the school opened the next day, Lisa and Sophie were gone. Their paintings, however, were still there, 2 new canvases hanging in the art room. The students who entered could swear they saw the girls' faces hidden in the shadows of the paintings, their expressions frozen in eternal horror. Miss Kearney smiled as she welcomed her next class.
There's someone in the hallways. I can hear them breathing.
Sarah's voice trembled as she pressed herself against the cold metal lockers, her hand gripping her phone tightly. On the other end of the line, Jake was silent for a moment, processing her words. The school had been empty long after hours, long after the last janitor had left. The two of them had stayed behind to work on a project that neither of them really cared about. But now, Sarah wasn't so sure they were alone. "Stay where you are," Jake whispered back, his voice barely audible. He was on the opposite side of the school, somewhere in the basement where the old equipment was stored, searching for supplies. "Don't move," Jake demanded Sarah through the phone. But something was moving. A slow, deliberate dragging sound echoed down the corridor, accompanied by a faint wheeze, almost like someone struggling to breathe. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her throat tight with fear. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she inched forward, her shoes barely making a sound against the linoleum floor. The lockers loomed around her, shadowed by the dim emergency lights that flickered weakly above. She glanced down the hall, and her breath caught in her throat. A dark figure stood at the far end, illuminated by the pale, buzzing light from a flickering exit sign. It was tall, too tall for a human, and impossibly thin, its long arms dragging along the floor, fingers scraping with a horrible metallic screech. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, as though its neck had been snapped, and its chest rose and fell with the sound of raspy labor breaths. "Sarah," Jake whispered in her ear through the phone. "Get out of there, now." The thing turned toward her, its head twisting further, the cracked neck making a sickening grinding noise. Its face, or what was left of it, was nothing more than a hollowed-out cavity, a gaping black hole where eyes should have been, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Get out of there, now," Jake yelled through the phone. Sarah's legs felt like jelly as terror surged through her. She forced herself to move, each step feeling like she was sinking into quicksand. The creature took a slow step toward her, its long fingers reaching out, dragging itself closer. She bit down on a scream, her throat burning with the effort to keep silent. Jake's voice was frantic now, barely controlled panic. "Sarah, you need to run. Please, run." Her body betrayed her, locking up in sheer horror. The creature's movements were grotesque, like it didn't know how to use its limbs. It shuffled forward with an eerie, unnatural gait, the sound of bone on metal filling the empty hallway. Suddenly, the emergency lights blinked out. Total darkness. A scream tore from Sarah's throat, piercing the suffocating silence. She bolted blindly down the hallway, her hand slapping the wall as she tried to feel her way forward, the phone still clutched in her other hand. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, and her chest burned with every breath, but the only thing she could think of was getting away from it. Behind her, the creature let out a low, guttural moan, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. It was closer now. She could feel its presence like a weight on her back, a cold, suffocating force that chilled her to the bone. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Jake was calling her again. She fumbled with it, answering without thinking. "I can't," she gasped, her voice shaking. "I don't know where I am," she cried with tears falling down her cheek. "Don't stop." Jake's voice was urgent. "I'm coming to you. Just keep moving." A sudden bang echoed through the hallway, and Sarah froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. The noise was deafening in the otherwise silent school. Something had slammed into one of the locker doors with enough force to bend the metal. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat and took off again, sprinting blindly, the sound of her shoes slapping against the floor, echoing off the walls. In the pitch-black darkness, the school felt like a labyrinth, every turn disorienting. She couldn't tell how far she had run, or if she was even heading toward the exit anymore. Then, Up ahead, she saw a faint light in one of the classrooms. With a burst of energy, Sarah darted toward the door, slamming it behind her. She shoved the desk in front of it, her fingers trembling as she turned the lock. The tiny classroom was a familiar space, the kind of place where she had spent hours half asleep in lectures. Now it felt like a tomb. She could still hear Jake's voice on the other end of the call. "Sarah, where are you?" "I'm in one of the classrooms. It has a faint light turned on. Please come find me, Jake, but be careful." It was right down the hall. "Whatever it is," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She crouched down behind the teacher's desk, pulling her knees to her chest. I think it's following me." Suddenly, the overhead light flickered on. The sudden brightness was harsh, and Sarah blinked, disoriented. The door handle rattled. "Jake, is that you?" She screamed through the phone, but it quickly disconnected. Her heart dropped. Slowly, she peeked over the edge of the desk. The door was shaking violently, the lock straining against whatever was trying to force its way inside. With a sickening crunch, the metal gave way, and the door creaked open. But no one was there. The hallway outside was completely empty. Her phone buzzed again, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the screen. The call had ended, and a new text message from Jake was waiting for her. "It's inside the room." She felt a chill crawl down her spine. Slowly, she looked up, scanning the classroom. At first, it seemed normal. Desks were neatly aligned. The whiteboard was covered with equations from that morning's lesson, and the windows looked out into the dark courtyard. Then her eyes landed on the far corner of the room. The creature was crouched there, huddled in the shadows like a grotesque, forgotten thing. Its head twitched unnaturally, jerking with spasms as if it was trying to hold its broken neck together. Slowly and impossibly, it unfolded its limbs, standing to its full height, its head almost scraping the ceiling, and Ida began to shuffle toward her. Sarah scrambled to her feet, knocking over chairs in her panic. The thing moved faster now, its limbs bending in grotesque angles, its breathing ragged and hollow. Then, it lunged at her. At that moment, time moved slowly. Sarah knew that it was over for her. She thought about Jake. Just 10 hours earlier, they were sitting at lunch, laughing about their math teacher, Mrs. Carroll, bending down and ripping her skirt in the back. She thought about that stupid project she knew they were going to get at least a B on. She wondered why they just didn't work on it at her house. How stupid of her. She then thought about Jake, where he could possibly be. Why couldn't he save her? "I hope he's safe at least," she thought in despair. Her back hit the chalkboard and she screamed just as the lights cut out again, plunging her into suffocating blackness. She was frozen in place, feeling its cold breath on her skin. Her phone buzzed once more in her hand. The message read, "Are you scared yet?" As Sarah pressed herself against the chalkboard, her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The creature was right in front of her now, close enough for her to smell the rot on its breath, a mix of decay and something far worse. Its mouth was wide open, stretching into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Sarah's heart raced, her hand trembling as her phone buzzed again, the sound seeming deafening in the suffocating silence. "It's already inside your head." She blinked, confused. Her head throbbed. The creature wasn't just looking at her, it was inside her, its cold presence slithering into her mind like a parasite, uninvited and unstoppable. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, not from her phone, but from behind her ear. "I've been waiting for you." The creature's face began to change, twisting into someone familiar. It was Jake's face. "I told you to run, Sarah. Why didn't you listen?" the creature said in a raspy version of Jake's voice. Sarah tried to make a run for the door, but the creature grabbed her, flashing a devilish grin with Jake's soulless face. The creature's face began to shed once again, but this time it was her own face, warped, grinning back at her. She let out a terrifying scream that echoed through the halls, but it wasn't her voice anymore. The following day, there was no school project to turn in, but more importantly, there was no more Jake and Sarah. The day Mrs. Dale didn't show up was the day everything changed. Madison tapped her foot nervously under the desk, glancing at the empty teacher's chair. Mrs. Dale never missed school, never. So when Mr. Weaver walked in, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was tall, rail-thin, and unnervingly pale. His skin had a sickly, almost translucent quality, like parchment stretched too thin. His eyes were the worst part. Black, too black, like there was no depth. He wasn't just looking at them. It felt like he was sizing them up. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice soft but crawling under their skin like a tick. "I'm Mr. Weaver. I'll be filling in for Mrs. Dale." Indefinitely. No one responded. The silence wasn't the usual, awkward quiet of bored students. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Madison caught Eric's eye from across the room. He looked uneasy, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. She gave him a questioning look, but all he did was shake his head, his eyes darting back to Mr. Weaver. "Let's begin," Mr. Weaver said, placing an old, battered leather book on the desk. It wasn't a textbook. The cover looked ancient, cracked, and frayed at the edges, as if it had survived too many hands that shouldn't have touched it. Without another word, he opened it, his long fingers brushing the yellowed pages. The strange, musky smell of old paper filled the room, but there was something else, something sour, like rot, beneath it. As he started reading, the words were in no language Madison recognized. They were strange, guttural sounds, more like a chant than a lesson. His voice grew louder, rising and falling rhythmically, like a dark lullaby. Madison's skin crawled. She tried to focus, but the room itself seemed to shift. The lights flickered, and the air thickened. Every breath felt heavy, like breathing through wet cotton. She glanced at Eric again, and her stomach dropped. His face had drained of color, his mouth slightly open as though he was trying to speak but couldn't. His eyes were starting to gloss over. "Eric?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. Mr. Weaver's voice droned on, each word resonating in the pit of her stomach like a stone sinking into water. The edges of the room started to blur, shadows creeping in from the corners, closing in, tighter and tighter. Then Eric's hand shot up, slamming onto his desk with a loud bang. The class gasped, but Eric, he was frozen. His eyes were wide, pupils blown, his mouth hanging open as though he were choking. Madison reached for him, but before her fingers could touch his arm, his head snapped up and he let out a horrible sound, a gurgling rasp, like something was crawling out of his throat. "She's here," Eric choked, his voice hoarse and broken. "What? Who?" Madison's voice was barely above a whisper. Eric's head turned slowly, unnaturally, toward Mr. Weaver. "She's been waiting for you." Mr. Weaver stopped reading. The silence was deafening. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of his lips that never reached his eyes. "You've all been very patient," Mr. Weaver said, his voice now smooth, too smooth. "She's been waiting a long time for someone new." The lights flickered out. Total blackness swallowed the room. There was no sound, no movement, except for the slow, scraping drag of chairs as the students stood. Madison's breath hitched. She fumbled for her phone, but before she could turn on the light, she felt something, cold, clammy. Fingers. They slid across her neck, brushing her skin so lightly It almost felt like a breeze, except for the unmistakable weight of it. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she froze. The fingers lingered, then tightened, just slightly. In the darkness, someone giggled a high-pitched childish giggle that sent ice straight through her veins. Then the lights flickered back on. Madison's eyes darted around the room, panic rising. The students were standing, all of them, their faces slack, their eyes wide and vacant. But it wasn't just that. Their skin was pale, too pale. Veins pulsed beneath their skin, dark and swollen, like they were filled with something thick and unnatural. And Eric was at the center of it all, his body twitching unnaturally. His mouth opened wide, wider than humanly possible, and from inside came a woman's voice, shrill and filled with malice. "I need more," she said darkly. Madison stumbled back, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "Eric, what's happening to you?" But it wasn't Eric anymore. Mr. Weaver stepped forward, his shadow stretching unnaturally long behind him. "The spirit inside him was bound to me once. Now it needs a new vessel." The students began to move, but not like people, like marionettes, their limbs jerking with violent spasms. They moved toward Madison, their dead eyes locked on her. "Eric, please." Madison's voice broke as the tears welled up, but Eric, or whatever had control of him, now smiled. That wide, hollow smile that stretched across his face like a mask. "You're next," Eric whispered, his voice layered with the hiss of the woman inside him. She turned to run, her heart pounding in her chest, but before she could reach the door, the lights blinked out again. Total darkness, and then breath. Hot, moist breath on the back of her neck. You can't escape. The voice of Eric and the spirit echoed all around her, in her head, inside her own mind. The floor seemed to give way beneath her feet. The world tilted, and suddenly she was falling into something endless. The lights flickered once more, and she was standing in the middle of the classroom, alone. No students, no Mr. Weaver, just the empty desks and that ancient book sitting on the teacher's desk. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy. Slowly, she looked down at her hands, and her heart stopped. Her fingers were long, bony, pale, and her reflection in the window, it wasn't her anymore. The spirit smiled back at her, wearing her face,